So, Kristy, thank you very much for talking to me today. I really appreciate you taking the time. We're going to talk a lot about democracy and the news and the way the world is changing. So, I thought I would start just by introducing you to the students by asking you to talk about your job as managing director of the News Co Lab. Tell us and them particularly what the lab is and what your job there involves.
Sure. So my name is Kristy Roschke. I'm the managing director of the News Collab at Arizona State University. And we, generally speaking, we work on issues related to media literacy and how the public understands news, typically through kind of three main stakeholders. We work with news organizations, media organizations to help them bridge that gap between the information we provide and how people are understanding it, and to work on issues of, establishing credibility for their own organizations, their own brands. We education, so I teach a number of media literacy courses, both within the university, but also groups, including seniors and other adults, high school students. So in introducing media literacy principles kind of across the cycle. And then we work in the technology space with technology companies, both in developing and thinking about tools can make media distribution and credibility, transparency, and people's experiences better, and help people better learn information. So there's a lot of kind of consulting and project work in that way. We also conduct original research and collaborate with partners across those stakeholders.
Very interesting and very important, I think, today too.
Very timely work now.
Absolutely. So people have access today to many more sources of information than they did in the past. And at the same time, perhaps the world is getting more complicated. It's changing more quickly. So how do you see that as impacting our society today?
Sure, there's a variety of ways, and ways is what you said, which is we have so much more information available to us, and not just available, like readily available. We get push alerts on our mobile phones when news breaks, and sometimes we don't even ask for them. It comes to us, and so we are seeing so much more information than we have had ever before. So that availability in itself is confusing, or can be confusing for people, because you just so inundated with information, it becomes difficult to know where to turn your attention. So we have this issue of attention. But most of us don't have much attention span at this point, and we're seeing so much information that not a lot sticks. And then also it becomes harder to know sort of the provenance of information. You might see something on a Twitter feed, for instance, and you read it and you're not really sure where it came from, but decide to take it as fact. You might share it with friends and family. It's a lot of our information becomes sort of separate from that original source. So that's one issue with this information overload. Another issue, I think, depending on who you are and maybe how old you are and your backgrounds, is that so much information comes to us via technology. It's mediated by technology. And most of us are pretty savvy at using mobile technology and digital tools at this point, but being able to use the tool and being able to really understand how the tool works are two different things, right? I can send a text message, but that's not the same as me understanding the text message is sent. So when a lot of our communication is sent via these methods that we maybe don't have the cognitive ability to understand all of the inner workings of it, it sort of makes it different to understand how to use information differently. We don't often think about the source of that information, and I don't just mean like if it came from a news outlet versus another person, but I mean like where did it originate and why am I seeing what I'm seeing and who's putting it in front of me? Those kinds of questions about digital technology are confusing to people as well, and it's not something that gets taught really very explicitly in any kind of formal education.
Absolutely, and that's led to you being very involved in the improvement of digital media literacy, and I guess to some degree you've explained why that needs to be improved. But so we might move on and talk about your argument that citizens' role in as consumers of news might be described largely today as passive. And you argue that people need to be more active in their consumption of news, I guess. So what do you mean by that?
So, and I think historically, consuming information has been a passive act, right? So even, 20th century, we received a newspaper, we read that newspaper, we disposed of that newspaper, and maybe we talked about it with our family or at work the next day, but it was pretty much an individual, me taking in that information, and then whether or not I did something with it nobody really cared, including the journalist who wrote the story. It was just sort of a one-way dissemination of information. Certainly that's not true anymore. What we do is still consuming in that way of, I see a news alert, so I'm going to read that article and move on. We actually have a much more active role to play, and many of us do play an active role without even really understanding that we do. So we might read something and have a knee-jerk reaction to send it in a text or share it on Facebook or comment to the reporter who tweeted it out, to send a note back. There are all these ways that we can interact with that information that many of us do to varying levels. And that's part of that understanding of how we know what we know. So that is actually part of the process of media literacy, is not only consuming information and learning from the information that's being presented, but also learning about the information in terms of who's sharing it, who's represented in that information, maybe who's not, how it makes us feel, why we're seeing it in a feed that's controlled by an algorithm, kinds of questions. We can better able to answer them and understand them when we're interacting with those tools in that active way.
So an active consumer of news is perhaps someone who is communicating with journalists, communicating with their friends, communicating maybe with a wider community about the news, to understand it, to express their views, and to be part of a discussion.
Absolutely. And, most of us do those types of things already, and maybe news isn't front and center in those experiences. Like maybe we have a Facebook group for our neighborhood, for instance, and we about, who needs to cut their lawn or whatever it is. That is certainly an active community. So part of that too is bringing in credible sources to say, well, what is the rule on that? Do I need to cut my lawn? Well, let me go to the city's website and provide that information for you so that I can help you make decisions. So it's sort of taking that information, and yes, I think it's creating a sense of community around it. Because of the world we live now, knowing what credible sources can help us make those decisions and finding them and then sharing them is a really important part of sort of where we are as a society, especially now since we were saying we're all kind of working from our homes and doing a lot of things virtually instead of having that opportunity to be with people face to face.
Okay, and so what you seem to be saying that COVID is meaning that we're interacting more online and getting our information more online, and we've lost some of that verification or of the information we're getting because we're not interacting as much face to face. That's very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a certain amount of research being done now and will continue in terms of long-term impact of the virtual nature of our communication, and again, the sort of technologically mediated nature of all of our communication in this moment that will provide lots of insights for years to come, I'm sure.
Absolutely. Okay, so you started to talk about trust, and research seems to show, you're the specialist on this rather than me, but it seems to show that people's trust in the established media is declining. We trusted them a lot more in the past. Why do you think that is, and why do you think it's important, and what do you think should be done about it?
Sure. There's probably a lot of reasons for that. And trust in the business of journalism and sort of what we would consider the mainstream media has been declining for decades. So this is definitely not a new phenomenon, but it certainly has accelerated, I'd say, in the last 4 to 10 years. And part of participation actually kind of contributes to that we can't vocal or see people who are more vocal against established media in our media feeds, which might make us think differently about the media. So it's sort of participation could be a double-edged sword for sure. But I think we've seen a trend in society globally in a decline in trust of institutions, democratic institutions that we typically rely on for credible information. So Edelman, which is a worldwide global communications firm, does this trust barometer survey every year. They survey a number of countries, developing and developed nations around the world, and across many institutions, government, higher ed, healthcare, and then media, we've seen declines in trust across all of those. So there is this phenomenon that who we consider experts and who we give our trust to is changing. Some of that is political polarization. Some of that is the perception of political polarization. So there's a lot of argument, and are we as polarized as we think we are, as the narrative is? And certainly there's a chasm between the two of the spectrum that's greater than has been before. But not everyone's on social media, so social media is not actually a mirror to real life. A lot of things that are in the trust issue, as it relates to the media, it certainly hasn't helped that narrative from elected officials in the last 4 years has become increasingly negative toward media, and even violent at times toward media, enemy of the people, those kinds of things. Those don't help perceptions of trust when they're coming from people who are represents a part of the citizenry, right? So I think that, and then I'll go back to the information overload. When all of the information is as available as anything else, establishing expertise, credibility, authority becomes much more difficult than it was when we were, again, sort of receiving a daily paper or two and maybe watching the news 3 times a day. Those were obvious people that we looked to give us information we couldn't otherwise access. And those gatekeepers really just don't exist anymore.
Absolutely. And one of the concerns that also seems to be being expressed, which you were moving on to talk about there, is the idea that the media itself is becoming more biased today, perhaps. And so I thought I would ask you about what you thought was happening there, and whether media should strive to be more objective. Should be trying to get all of the media objective, or is it appropriate that they be biased in some way?
Sure. So it's an interesting question, and there's a big debate around objectivity, occurring in journalism circles now. Objectivity is a pretty 20th century construct. So news wasn't always objective. In fact, most modern news was not. It was quite partisan. Our local paper, the paper of record for Arizona, is the Arizona Republic, and it started as the Arizona Republican. So it was, at once very clearly aligned with the Republican Party. So I'll give you my opinion, and I think it's a growing opinion, but it's certainly not the prevailing opinion right now. I think objectivity is sort of a misplaced goal for journalism. And I'll say it this way. I think what I mean by that is the notion that a journalist is a person that doesn't have their own beliefs, and that we somehow, subscribe to this idea that I don't have any, I don't vote, I don't have things that I care about in my community. That's just a false premise. Journalists have they're members of their community, and I'm not advocating for bias, but I do think understanding people have a point of view, which is different, right? And my points of view they're not biased. They're just how I see the world. And I think it's important for you to understand, where I come from, so that you understand how I report things. And I can absolutely report fairly and accurately on events that I'm witnessing, and I can talk to people to create a story in that way without having to be neutral on a subject. And there are a lot of subjects in our world that there should not be neutrality on, hate speech and hate groups, for instance. It's not a two sides kind of story. And to present a story as, hate groups bad, but also let's hear from a person in a hate group, that just perpetuates ideas that are bad for society. So I don't think objectivity is a goal. I think transparency is not a replacement for objectivity, but being more transparent about how we choose our sources, why we cover the stories that we cover. Those are all choices that we make that aren't neutral. They never have been neutral. We've just pretended they are. And if we talked about that more as journalism, it might help people better understand the decision-making process. I don't know that it will necessarily automatically then claims of bias, because I think that's a very popular thing for people to want to say. But I do think it will help people understand how things come to be in front of their faces. Why am I reading this? Why am I hearing this? Oh, I understand it's important for this reason. This person is being interviewed for this reason. We didn't interview this person for this reason, that sort of thing. And one thing I'll say that I meant to question that also relates to objectivity is there are plenty of groups of people that exist in the world that have not been represented in objective mainstream media for centuries. And those people have always had low levels of the media because they haven't seen themselves represented. And part of that has been because the objective has been from a very specific, which in the 20th century was mostly male, mostly white. And that's what became the standard for objectivity by default, because that's who journalists were. That's certainly not the world that we live in. And I don't think it should be the world that shouldn't be our standard. So a lot of these questions are interrelated, and you're seeing movement in journalism to address those things. The last thing I'll say is that I'm not suggesting that all news needs to be partisan or needs to be explicit about a point of view. But I do think we need better labeling to differentiate between commentary, opinion pieces, and reported pieces, because they are different and they're done by different types of people. People who write opinion columns do not report news, and that's something that most people don't have a good understanding of. So I think being fair is a better goal than being neutral, I guess, in summary of that sort of sprawling answer.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. I think it explains it very clearly. And basically, you seem to be saying that everyone has an opinion, whether they're a journalist or not. And it's important to acknowledge that will be the case, but at the same time, to try to report a story fairly.
Yeah, I mean, I think to give it's not as simple as this, but if I drive an electric car, that doesn't mean I can't report on gas-powered cars. Clearly, I've made a choice by having an electric car, and maybe I have views about gas cars, but that doesn't mean that I can't report on a gas-powered car facts on it. I mean, just again, I understand that many things are much more personal than that, so it's kind of a silly example. I just bristle at the notion that we, as humans, aren't able to reflect fairly on things that we have opinions about.
Yeah, that makes sense. And with that, then, with concerns about bias, there are also concerns about misinformation, about things that simply are not true and aren't within the range of opinion, but are just simply untrue, especially in social media. And I was interested in what you had to say about that and what might be able to be done about it.
Sure. Well, it's a huge problem that's not going away anytime soon, and it requires a number of interventions, both in terms on people work on the side of like, how do we find the people who are creating false information, purposely spreading it through social media, and how do we stop those activities? What are the responsibilities of social media platforms to label or even remove certain types of content that are false? And we're grappling with a lot of that right now, all the way over to like my side of things, which is how can we help people better recognize what they're looking at, and make decisions based on that, so how can we not fall for misinformation, as it were? How can we help avoid really strong reactions to information that might make us make decisions we wouldn't otherwise? Because we know that the most successful mis and disinformation, to distinguish quickly between those two terms, misinformation can be false, but it could be a mistake, it could be satire. There's a lot of things that fall into a bucket of misinformation as something that's not factually accurate. There's no reason to spread false information, and that's where the sort of disinformation comes in, is that there's an intention to willfully something is false, and typically that intention is to cause harm, confuse people, create chaos. So, my side of things is sort of we not contribute to that and avoid believing things that are not true, that are not rooted in fact. And so all of that is to say there's a number of ways we need to tackle this problem, and a lot of doing really great work in all of those. I do think it's interesting to note that the amount of like actual fake information that is being in perpetual on social media is a smaller amount than this sort of stuff that sits in a hybrid. There's a kernel of truth in it, and we can wrap a different context around it. So, for instance, with the rise of the QAnon conspiracy theories, there's typically some fact in there, some little nugget in there that's true, something that's rooted in fact, and then you create a bunch of content and context around that makes it patently false, but it's not exactly fake information. And so we've seen the evolution of misinformation around the 2016 US election. Was a lot of just purely invented information that filtered into the information stream. And we were believing things like the Pope had endorsed Donald Trump, which is, that's happens. But now we've moved into arguably a more dangerous territory where it really requires nuance for someone to peel back layers of a piece of information to say, okay, well, yeah, that is true, but these are all the reasons why it's not true, So that's kind of where we are now. And it's a place to be because it's even harder than you can usually identify a fake story, but something that sits in the middle is a little harder for the average person maybe to discern, and also who has time to do that, which is probably the biggest problem for us as users of media. Is like, we might have great intention, but we're not going to fact check everything that crosses feeds, like ever is going. So how do we kind of what process do we put to better vet things in that like snap judgment sort of way, which is a lot of what I teach.
Okay, so things that are a little true are more dangerous than things that are completely false.
I mean, potentially, yes, mostly because they're harder to identify as false. You have to get that label of like, well, yes, but, and then you have to go into a longer explanation of why it's false. And usually those kinds of truths or hybrid truth information taken out of context is successful because it's hitting some emotion that we feel, it's taking it into some deeply held belief, or it's making us feel something. And that's kind of, I think, why it can be more dangerous.
Yeah, absolutely. Very interesting. I did want to ask you one question about the advice that you would have, or the practical advice that you would give to people about their own digital media literacy. So, you teach about this, and I'm sure, it takes a fair bit of time to give people all the advice you would want to. But what, do you have a couple of things maybe, or maybe a little more than that, that you would say to people, this is really what you should do that will improve your literacy, quickly?
Sure. I do have a couple of things, and they're pretty common sense types of activities, and you probably say, oh, sure, I do that. But really, I think we do more than we do. And in fact, research would indicate that most of us think better at spotting misinformation than we actually are. So it's good common sense thing. So I think the first one I tend to share is, if a piece of information seems too good to be true, or it makes you really angry, or it makes you vindicated about something or sad, you should immediately be suspicious of it. There should be a healthy of suspicion there, because most news, quite frankly, is not that interesting. It's like, when we are talking taxes, simply not interesting. It's necessary information, but not interesting. So if someone's telling me something about taxes that makes me really mad, I need to be skeptical of that, because there's probably potentially something to that that's not true. Or it's coming from a specific point of view that I recognize, so that I can understand why the information is presented in the way it is. So that's the first thing, is know how you're reacting to information. And if you have a reaction, the thing you can do is to certainly not share it with anybody. You should never do anything out of a place of anger or fear or, anything like that. You should just move on for a second. If you're so inclined to learn more because it made you feel that strongly, then you need a second source or a third source. And the easy way to do that is just Google it. If you've something in an article or seen something in a meme or, had say something on, your WhatsApp chat, just Google it and find out if you can reputable sources that corroborate the same thing. And that could take you under 10 seconds. If you see a bunch of news sources that you're familiar with that have said that, then great. You can feel good about the fact that it's a thing that has happened, and you can move on, and then you can share it if you want to and provide your own commentary and participate in that way, because you've done that due diligence. So that's sort of the second thing, is when something matters to you or you're feeling a strong reaction to something, you should take that 10 seconds to maybe a minute to just find out what it is that you're looking at. And are there other people saying the same thing? Or are they saying totally different things? And it might take you down a rabbit hole. You might end up spending the next half hour on this, but that's okay, because now you don't have to do that for everything. I think it's bad advice to suggest we're going to, again, I said, we're going to fact check or we're going to try to check the credibility of every single thing. So I would say limit that to the pieces of information you most are likely to act on, the things you care about most. So I think those are two simple things that you can do. And there's probably another thing in there that I'll think of later, but I'll stop there.
I think those are good. That's good advice in itself, to check on something that looks like it's too good to be true. That seems like solid advice, and probably will help a lot of people.
Yeah.
Okay. I also wanted to, I know you've expressed opinion in the past about academic knowledge. And because we often think that in academia, we're very, very careful about reporting truth, I guess, and you've argued that is something which is not necessarily true, and that there's a need to strengthen the quality of information that comes from academic sources too.
I mean, I think, yeah, just like anything else, those systems can be fallible, and can be, lend themselves to not being as solid as we'd like them to say it to be. But I kind of think the bigger issue is being people who aren't in academia and who don't regularly encounter academic journals or studies in that way, but maybe see that information reported in the press. There's a couple of things there. I don't think that, I know that the general public doesn't tend to know how academics do their research and how it comes to be published and what the process of peer review is and why that's important, whether a journal has been peer reviewed or it hasn't. With COVID, we've seen so many preprints coming out about COVID research, and that's a really great thing because we're putting information out to be used by other people fast. As you know, is like not a hallmark of academic research. Fast is not a word anyone would ever use. The preprints are super helpful, but also can be very dangerous because I'm sure you've seen examples of where a preprint has made it big and made the rounds in the general population and then has been retracted. And that complicates things for a couple of reasons. One, for the regular person, it can create a sense of distrust, like, well, maybe I should trust academic research because now you're telling me that this is true, because they don't understand that vetting process. And it also creates distrust or creates problems because once it gets out into the public sphere, it's very hard to put that back into the box. So there was an article recently, I haven't even read it, full disclosure, but I've seen about it. I think it was a Danish article about how masks aren't effective. It wasn't peer reviewed as a preprint, and in that narrative, you probably even just heard, like, that's all I heard, and that was enough for me to be like, oh, great, because from my understanding, everybody saw that. And then lots of regular people and other academics started using that their basis for their truth. The fact that it was later retracted and there's lots of problems with the study nobody cares about that. So you still keep saying, well, the Danish people are saying that, the masks are bad. And that's the thing that keeps getting spread around. So like transparency in the journalism process, I think we need better transparency in the knowledge creation process. You know, how do we come to these conclusions? How did that study happen? How did it get out into the world, and why do those things matter? So that those of us who are not experts but have a voice, and collectively that voice on social media can grow to be very loud, how we can use that voice to perpetuate the right information, not the incorrect information. So I think it's really important that we as instructors and people who work in universities and interact with students to not only help them learn how to conduct research, but help to explain how that information is produced to lay audiences, you know, so that I had this conversation the other day. Well, why am I reading a journal article today about research that was conducted in 2016? Well, I'll tell you, this is why. And there's an answer for that very few people know. So I think we've kept guarded the way that we create knowledge, not for any like insidious reason, but now that knowledge is easily accessible, we need to do a better job explaining how it's created.
Yeah, very interesting that you say this, because as we do academic writing, we're supposed to do the things that you're saying that we're supposed to do, in that we do explain how the research was conducted. A good academic article should say that. Right. And it should also, at the end, explain the limitations on what was, on the conclusions that were reached. But at the same time, what seems to happen is that the conclusions are reported, but there isn't explanation of the process or the limitations. And, you know, as academics, we would say those things are very important, but that doesn't transfer to the public sphere.
That's such an excellent point. Our audience in that regard is, and you're right, that's parcel of putting together a journal article, but that's for other academics, you know, that's for a very different audience. It's such an excellent point. And we're not telling the journalist who interviews us, or that doesn't make it in the press release that the university puts out about the research, that, oh, the sample size was 2, you know, or, you know, the p-value was this. That's such an excellent point.
It's a very, yeah, I find it very interesting to hear you talk about this too, because it is something that definitely, you know, there does seem to be an issue with. Interesting. Okay, last question was around the students who are watching this. A lot of them are going to be graduating soon. So for everyone I interview, I ask them, you know, based on the fact that you graduated from your first degree a little while ago, you might have something valuable to say to the students about their future careers, you know, the advice that you would like to give them. So I'd like to close by asking you to do that.
Yeah, I love that question. And if with your permission, I'm going to steal that for all my future reviews for my classes. It's such a great idea. So yeah, I think my advice is that no one knows, or very few people, I should say, know where they're going to be in 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And not only do we not know necessarily what the course of our career will take us, or how our interests may morph and change, and what new opportunities may present themselves with each new experience. I think something that we need to grapple with, particularly as it relates to technology, is we also can't really predict what jobs will be. You know, where will the need be for our respective industries, and how can we be ready to answer that call? And I think keeping an open mind and always asking questions and being curious in every role that you have, even if it's not the job of your dreams, it's that collective experience that brings you someplace. You know, I'm 30 years out of undergrad and am anywhere close to where I imagined I was, but every piece of that experience has put me here. So a lot of it you can't predict. And I think curiosity is probably the best trait of an employee at any level of their career, but especially when you're just starting out, because chances are your first job may not be your last job, and it may not be one that you really, really wanted, but there's always learn. Even if it's not directly related to what you want to do, you're going to pick up something if you're curious and you're asking questions and you're paying attention to the people in your surroundings. And I think that puts people better able to anticipate and adjust to, you know, a Zoom life, for instance. You're graduating into a Zoom life that we didn't predict just a year ago. And here you are already via that experience, better to translate that to the working world than a lot of us that haven't been doing this so long. So curiosity, I think, is my best piece of advice.
And so much more important today with the world changing as quickly as it is, being curious and learning more about the new environment and how you can survive and prosper inside that.
That's right. Because we want to prosper. We don't want to have to feel like we're always just hanging on and trying to figure out the thing. And a lot of times that's not actually having deep knowledge in something. It's just being able to adapt and connect dots between something you already know and how you can apply it to this new scenario.
Well, Kristy, thank you very much for talking to me today. I really appreciate it. The students at the University